Hey, this is Charles with Rocky Mountain ATV-MC. Today I'm going to show you how to assemble your RZR XP 1000 engine. Welcome back to our engine rebuilding series. In the last video, we cleaned and inspected all of our engine parts, and as you can see, we have it all laid out behind us and we're ready to go back together. So that's what this video is focusing on, is just the assembly of your engine. To do this job, we're going to need several different common hand tools, including some torque wrenches. Now, specific things, what we're going to need are a cylinder holding and camshaft timing plate. This comes with the 2 bolts. Then also we have an engine stand adapter. We have a torque angle gauge, a strap wrench. There is a lot of torque on the flywheel bolt, so you're going to want to have this and maybe even a friend to help you hold everything in place. You're also going to want feeler gauges. We have a magnet, and then safety glasses, rags, rubber gloves, and you always want to refer to your model specific service manual for more information, proper procedures, and specs. Now, as far as parts go, the most exciting part is the pistons. We're installing some high compression pistons to get a little more power out of our machine. Now, these piston kits come with the rings, wrist pins, circlips, and everything you need to get that back together. We're also using the Vertex complete gasket set. That's going to come with all of the gaskets and seals for the top and bottom end. And then when you go back together with this, keep in mind that some of the bolts you removed are torque to yield bolts, which means they're a single use bolt and they actually stretch out. So the connecting rod cap bolts, you need to replace those. We have our case half bolts, and then we also have our cylinder head bolts. Now, as far as plain bearings go, we're using the plain bearings from Hot Rods. And on these, when you go to order them, keep in mind the number 2 position for your main bearing, it will have one bearing that is different than the rest. So keep that in mind. We have the connecting rod bearings here, and then also our countershaft bearings. Now, the other things we have up here, obviously we're going to want to run new spark plugs, new oil filter and crush washer, and then we have assembly lube and some engine oil to help lube some other things up, and also some gasket maker. This is the Motosil. And depending what you did with your head and what measurements you took when you took this apart, you may need some new buckets. Now, keep in mind these buckets come with a shim built in, and they're also known as tappets on the OEM diagram. So if you need those, don't forget them. And again, you can find those under the OEM diagram. Now, as you go throughout this entire process, it's a lot of information, so always make sure you refer to your model specific service manual for more information, proper procedures, and specs. All right, since we're using new parts, we're going to check the ring end gaps on our piston rings. Now, most of the time, these are spot on right out of the box, but we just want to double check that and make sure we're good. So what we're going to do is install these into the cylinder, and we're going to use the piston to square them up. So I'll just set this in here until that edge on the piston is flush with the edge on our cylinder right there. Pull it out. We'll take our feeler gauge and we'll check the ring end gap. We'll take this one out. This one's the top ring. The spec on this is 10 to 14 thousandths of an inch. And then for the second ring, the spec is going to be 15 to 25 thousandths of an inch. And we'll do the same thing with the feeler gauge. Make sure that gap is within spec. So for these piston rings, I'm only going to measure these 2 compression rings. And again, the second ring, this is the darker ring. It's a little bit wider as well, and the top ring is a little bit thinner. Another thing I want to point out on these 2 rings is that they have marks on them. And when you install these onto the piston, you're going to want to have these marks facing up. Now, as far as the gaps on the oil rails, I'm not even going to worry about those. So we'll go ahead and take those same measurements for the rings on the second piston. And if this ring gap is too tight, you can use a file to open that gap up a little more. Now that we have our ring gaps checked, we're going to go ahead and install these piston rings onto the pistons. So for this oil expander, what we're going to do, it separates right here, and this one has a wire holding it all together. We're going to put that in the very bottom groove, and when you install that, make sure if yours doesn't have that wire in there, make sure the ends don't overlap. And then for the oil rails, we're gonna put one of the gaps facing forward and one facing back. And what I mean by forward is we have this arrow on the top of the piston. This arrow is facing the exhaust side. And then when you're installing these rings, you wanna make sure you don't overexpand them, because if you do, they're gonna break. All right, now for the second compression ring. We're gonna install this with the gap facing the intake side. And again, we have this number and letter right here. Now for the top compression ring, it just has the end, and again, that's gonna be facing up. Now we'll go ahead and do these same steps to the other piston. Now at this point, we can flip our pistons over, and we're going to install a snap ring on one side in the piston pin boss. Now to get this circlip in place, we need to have it end so the gap is either at the 12 o'clock or the 6 o'clock position. So what I'm going to do is put one in first, and then I'm going to keep my thumb over this, and I'm going to work it into place. And I'm going to use this screwdriver just as a ramp. You don't want to force it all in at once. You just want to take small bites to work this on. Now the next step is to install our connecting rod in the correct position. And I just want to point out, as we assemble this engine, anything that moves, we're going to apply either engine oil to it or some assembly lube. So we'll go ahead and do that. And these connecting rods, if you're reusing them, you want to make sure they're in the same orientation as when they came out. So for ours, we have this 3-digit code right here, and this was facing the exhaust side when we took this out. So on our top of our piston, we have that arrow. So we're going to have this number facing this side of the piston when we install it. All right, so next step, we're going to install our wrist pin or piston pin, whatever you want to call it. Slide that into place, and then we'll install the remaining circlip. And then we'll go ahead and do the same procedures on the other piston and connecting rod, but just make sure these circlips, they need to be fully seated in their groove. So you want to verify that they're all the way down in there. Now at this point, we're going to install these pistons into these cylinders. Now these cylinders have a little taper at the bottom to help compress the rings a little bit as they go in. So we're going to apply some lube to this. And again, make sure that your arrow is facing the correct direction. So this is the exhaust side of our cylinder. So we want that arrow facing this side. You also want to coat the cylinder wall with oil as well. Now you want to make sure that your piston rings are still in the correct orientation. And then we're going to compress these rings with our fingers. And then you can rock the piston back and forth just a little bit to help work everything down into place. And as you're going through the process, just be careful. You don't want to force anything. That's how you would catch a ring on an edge and break it. Just take your time and be patient. Then we'll go ahead and do the same steps with the other piston. Next, we're going to mount our engine stand adapter plate to the upper case half and tighten both of these bolts down. And next, we'll slide this into our engine stand. With this case half facing right side up, we need to make sure we have both dowel pins in place. Then we'll set the gasket down into position, and we'll also set our cylinder down on top. After that, we can install the cylinder holding and camshaft timing plate. Now once that's in place, we can go ahead and flip this motor over. The next thing we'll do is install all of the plain bearings. Now for this, we're going to reference that little chart we made using the codes on the crankshaft, the case halves, and we're going to put everything in order. So you want to reference this. Now keep in mind this center bearing surface, This one on the bottom side of the case half, it's going to have that different style of bearing. It's going to be solid all the way around. So just remember that when you're reassembling. And to put these in place, you'll first line up the locating groove and then just push down on the other end. Now, if you got any oil on the sealing surface, I recommend wiping it off now. It's going to be easier before we start putting other parts on this, because in a later step, we will be using some sealant on this case half. Next thing, we need to install our chains. So we have the one for the oil pump. And again, we already lubed this up with some oil. All of the rotating parts, we're lubing everything up with oil. We'll go ahead and install this cam chain as well. We chose to go with a new cam chain. If you do that, you can find this under the OEM diagram, or you could go with something like one from Hot Rods. After that, we're going to tip the crankshaft up. We're going to have this flange facing towards the crankshaft. Next, we'll take this oil drain diverter. We'll set it into place, and then we can install the crankshaft. And just keep in mind where this chain is while you're installing it. We need to line up the oil seal and also make note of where your connecting rods are. Then we can push up on our pistons from the bottom and guide these connecting rods into place. Next, we'll install the plain bearing into the connecting rod cap. And now we can install this. Now keep in mind, we have this number on the end. That needs to match the connecting rod. After that, we can install the brand new connecting rod bolts, and we'll tighten these down. Now that I have those loosely tightened down, I'm going to do the same steps on the other cap, and then we'll do our tightening sequence. And you'll notice when I'm installing these bolts, we don't have any lube on the threads. Same with the threads inside of the connecting rod. Those are all cleaned out and there's no oil down in there. All right, now we're going to do this tightening sequence, and just to make things easier, we put this end cap so it's facing up, and we'll go ahead, we'll torque these down to 9 foot-pounds first, and then we're going to take them up to 13 foot-pounds. Now for the final torque on these bolts, we're going to tighten them 105 degrees, and just to make sure that we get them there, I'm just going to mark where they're at right now. And then we can use this torque angle gauge to get us the rest of the way there. So on this, we have a socket on the bottom we're going to put on that bolt. And then this tab, it's just holding the degree wheel from moving. So I'm going to snap my breaker bar in at top, and then it will be helpful to have somebody hold the engine to keep it from moving. Now we can go ahead and do the same thing on the other side. And now we'll repeat these same steps for the other connecting rod. Next thing we need to do is install these bearing halves on the other side of the case half. Now I do want to point out that this number 2 position main bearing for the crankshaft is the solid bearing, and this tab, it's going to be on a different side than these other ones. All right, next step, we need to install our counterbalancer shaft. Now I do want to point out we have the timing marks we need to line up. All right, now that we have all of these parts in place, we're just going to do a final run around on this case half and make sure everything's really clean, that there's no oil on the surface. And then we can apply some gasket sealant on here. And when we do that, you want to make sure you're on the inside of these bolt holes. And as long as you go on the insides of them, then you're not going to get anything leaking out and coming out by that bolt hole. All right, so on this PTO side, we're going to start by applying some silicone. We're just using the MotoSeal gasket maker, and it really just needs to be a thin, even coat. It's just taking up any imperfections in the case halves. And if you get it too thick, it's going to get in the oil passageways. So just be really cautious around these areas right here by that seal where the oil flows. Just make sure you're following the sealant path that's outlined in the service manual. I'm just going to use a screwdriver and make sure we have plenty of clearance before that oil passageway starts. That way we don't get any stuck in there. And then I put a little extra where the seal meets the case half, just to make sure we get a good seal right there. I just want to point out, you need to check for both dowel pins, make sure they're in place. Now you can see we've moved this oil pump chain over by the counterbalancer. Now this is going to make it more accessible later on. Now when you install this case half, you want to make sure that you're not forcing anything in place. Make sure you have your seal lined up on that PTO side, and then also make sure that the surfaces mate flush against each other. Now if you've located that oil pump chain correctly, you can see you have easy access to it right now, and we'll get to it a little later on, but for now we're just going to install all the bolts on the bottom side of this case half. Now for these lower case half bolts, we have 3 different sizes. So the smallest size, it's going to go on the side. We have the 2 medium ones right here, and then we have 8 larger ones. These need to be brand new because when we torque them down, they're all going to get stretched. Real quick, we're going to do the tightening sequence just to get all these bolts seated, and then we'll actually start torquing them down. So this is going to be number 1, number 2, 3, 4, number 5, 6, number 7, 8, 9, 10, and 11. Now for the torquing sequence, these 8 bolts right here, we're going to torque these down first. So the first torque in the sequence is 9 foot-pounds. After that, we'll bring them up to 21 foot-pounds, and we're going to turn the bolts an additional 90 degrees following the same sequence. And the way we seated them, they're going to be torqued in that sequence as well. We're just not going to do 9, 10, and 11 at this point. Step 2 is 21 foot-pounds. The last step in the sequence is to turn these bolts an additional 90 degrees. So we're just going to use a breaker bar for that. Now these next 2 bolts, we're going to torque these down to 26 foot-pounds. Now once you've done that, you can go ahead and torque the small bolt to 9 foot-pounds. Next we can flip the motor over, and we're going to install all of these bolts into the top half of the case half. Now we have 2 of the bigger bolts, the rest will be the smaller bolts. Smaller bolts will be torqued down to 9 foot-pounds, and these 2 bigger bolts are going to be torqued down to 26 foot-pounds. And just make sure you follow the torque sequence given in the manual. So that's number 12, this is number 13, and these are going to 26 foot-pounds. All right, so now that we have 12 and 13 torqued down, 14 on, it's just going to be in a line all the way around the case halves. Next step, we'll flip the engine back over. The next step is to install our oil pump. So we're going to use a new O-ring right here, and I've applied some grease to it to help keep it in place. Then we're going to use a magnet. We'll pull that chain up, and we'll set that oil pump down into place. Then we can insert our 2 dowel pins. Now we can take our 3 bolts, we'll install these and torque them to 7 foot-pounds. Then we can install our oil pickup screen and torque that bolt down to 7 foot-pounds as well. All right, next step, we're going to apply silicone to where our drain pan will sit. And again, this just needs to be a really light coating. All we're trying to do is take up any imperfections. Now we can install our oil pan. First we'll install these 3 larger bolts, and then we can install the smaller bolts all the way around. Now with these bolts, there is a tightening sequence as well. So we have number 1 and number 2. We'll just get those snugged up a little bit right now. The other side we have 3 and 4. And then number 5 is right here, and we're going to work all the way around 6, 7, number 8, and number 9. And then on this back side, we have 10 through 13. We'll just go in order. Number 14 is the bigger bolt right in the middle. 15 right next to it. Last, number 16. So now that we have them all snugged up, we're going to go through the same sequence, but for the smaller bolts. All these will be 106 inch-pounds, and then the bigger bolts, you're going to be 26 foot-pounds. And don't forget to replace your crush washer. So we're going to get this installed and torque this bolt down to 12 foot-pounds. All right, now we can flip our motor over. All right, now on this side of the engine, I'm going to install these 2 O-rings. We'll install the oil cooler. We're going to torque that down to 7 foot-pounds. All right, next we're going to take this housing that holds our dipstick, install our new O-ring onto it, and we'll tighten the 4 bolts down.
Next thing, we'll remove the cylinder holding and camshaft timing plate. And I'm going to take a magnet and we're going to set this cam chain up out of the way. Okay, next thing, we're going to install this woodruff key. So we'll press that into place. And then we need to make sure this taper is completely clean. So we're going to use some contact cleaner on it. Wipe that down. And then this flat surface right here, we're actually going to apply some assembly lube to it because there's a bushing right there that rides on it. All right, now with the flywheel, we're going to remove this gear. And this tapered section, we need to make sure that's perfectly clean as well. So I'll spray that out, wipe it out with a clean rag. And then we're going to do 2 things. So number 1, we need to use a thread lock that seals bearings to shafts or pulleys to shafts. For me, I like to use this Honda Lock 3, but our service manual recommends the Loctite 641. But just as long as that's the purpose of the Loctite, you're going to be all right. So we're going to apply this just inside of the taper towards the big end. You don't have to go crazy with it, you just need a little bit. And then our service manual actually recommends applying some to the taper as well, but I don't want to risk any getting onto the bushing on our gear. So we're just going to apply it inside on this flywheel. And then I'm also going to apply assembly lube to all these rollers. You want to make sure none of this assembly lube gets in contact with the thread lock, otherwise that stuff isn't going to set up right. All right, now I'm going to take the gear, I'm going to reinstall that, and when you do this, you're probably going to have to rotate it and work it into place, just like that. We'll flip this over. We have this groove that's going to line up with our woodruff key. Got all that lined up. And then we can install this bolt. If you had any of that Loctite squeeze out around here, you want to wipe it up. And we can install the bolt, and we're going to torque this down to 133 foot-pounds. And when you do this, it's going to take a lot of torque. You have some really teeny bolts holding this to your motor mount, so it might be a good idea to have somebody help hold the motor while you torque it down. And as you torque this down, you just want to make sure that your cam chain isn't bound up at all, so make sure that's pulled all the way up and out of the way. All right, next step, we're going to take our cam chain, pull it up, and we're going to line up this line on the flywheel with this little rib on the side of our case. That way we have our piston exactly where we need it at top dead center. We'll drop that in there and clean the sealing surface for our head gasket. Then we can install our head gasket, make sure that both of your dowel pins are in place. Then we can set the cylinder head into place. All right, now for the cylinder head bolts, we have the two smaller ones that go on the side. Don't forget to get those in place. And then for the main bolts, we have all brand new bolts. Again, these are torque to yield bolts. And we'll get all of these finger tight right now. Next, we'll torque these in the sequence to 13 foot-pounds. So this is going to be number 1, number 2, number 3, 4, 5, and 6. Then we're going to take these to 26 foot-pounds in the same sequence. And then we'll turn each one 180 degrees in the same sequence. Next, we can torque these side bolts to 7 foot-pounds. All right, next step, we can lube and install all of our shims. Now, you might need new shims, but we need to install these and take measurements to find out where we need to go. After that, we can install our cam shafts. And make sure when you install these, you want to have plenty of assembly lube on them. Then we can install the cam caps. And again, where these cam journals ride, we're going to apply assembly lube to that as well. Make sure the dowel pins are in place, and we'll install our cam caps. Then these bolt threads, you want to lube them all up. We'll install all these bolts, and we're going to torque them down in sequence. Now the sequence on this is going to be number 1. We'll just get these finger tied at first, then torque them to 7 foot-pounds. This is number 2, number 3, 4, number 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and number 12. Now we can check our valve clearances. Now keep in mind, when you check these, you're going to want to have the cam lobes facing straight up for whichever valve clearance you're checking. So we'll go ahead and do that. Now keep in mind, the exhaust valves, you're going to be 10 thousandths of an inch plus or minus 2 thousandths. Intake, you're going to be 6 thousandths of an inch plus or minus 2 thousandths. Now if the cam doesn't rotate freely like this, just with your fingers, that means one of these valves are probably hanging open. So if you had your head machined, you may need to go with smaller shims. Now, a lot of times your machinist can tell you about how much material they took off, so they can tell you pretty close to what shim you're going to need. So you can start out there, and if you don't have any spare shims, what you can do is find one valve that has some clearance, and then take everything apart, use the smallest shim in the other positions, and that way you can get a feeler gauge in there and at least get a reading, and you can use the math formula to help determine your new shim size. If you have any more questions about that, you can refer to our valve adjustment video for the RZR 900 and 1000 engines. All right, and reason we do that, it's a lot easier to do all these clearance checks before we actually set our cam timing. So now that we know we're good there, we're going to go ahead and install our cam sprockets and our cam chain. Next, we'll take our cylinder holding and camshaft timing plate, and we're going to install it onto the end of these camshafts. So both of these cam lobes on the PTO side, we're going to put this cylinder at top dead center compression, and we're just installing the timing plate into these slots in the ends of the cam shafts. So again, the lobes are pointing away from each other, and we have our piston at top dead center compression. So now that we have the cam shafts in the correct position, I'm going to take a magnet, I'm going to pull the cam chain up And I just want to point out this is a clean magnet. It doesn't have a bunch of metal filings or anything like that on it. So I'm just going to set this out of the way, and we're going to make sure we're lined up. There's a mark on the flywheel. Now I'm going to hold the chain up so we can rotate this flywheel. It is a little bit off, so we have this line right here, and it needs to line up with the rib in the case half. So we'll just rotate it right there. Once that's dead on, we can install the exhaust cam sprocket. So the cam sprockets, they are exactly the same, but you want to return them to their original positions if you can. And for the exhaust, you want this E to where you can read it, and then both of these lines, they need to be flush with that cylinder head surface. So we'll go ahead and set this into place. And you can just rotate that sprocket until the marks are in the correct position, and then slide it on to that camshaft. So if I pull up on this chain, you can see that both lines are level with the cylinder head now. So I'm going to go ahead and install one of these cam sprocket bolts. And what I did, I just put some blue Loctite on it. The manual does recommend replacing these. And for now, we're just going to leave that finger tight, and we'll go ahead and install the intake cam sprocket. Now again, this is the same thing, except for we're going to have the eyes to where you can read them. And you want that chain right there, you need it to be tight while these are lined up. So I need to rotate this just a little bit. One tooth. So all the marks are lined up. We're still lined up on the flywheel with our marks, so we'll go ahead and put that bolt into place. And I'm just going to lightly snug these down with the T-handle. And then what we need to do is we're going to remove that cylinder holding and camshaft timing plate, and then we're going to rotate the engine counterclockwise just enough to expose the other bolt hole for the exhaust sprocket. We'll put that in and torque it down to 14 foot-pounds, and then we'll rotate the engine the other way, expose the bolt hole on the intake cam, and again torque that down to 14 foot-pounds. Now when I do rotate it this other way, I'm pushing on that tensioner just to make sure the chain doesn't skip time. Now if you don't do it in this sequence, this chain will have a tendency to jump time on you. So just be cautious of that, and after you get everything torqued down, make sure you verify your timing is correct. So we're going to verify our timing. Once you've done that, as soon as you move your wrench off of that flywheel bolt, it's going to turn these cam sprockets because those cam lobes are under spring tension. That's totally normal, don't worry about it. So now we can go ahead and torque these upper bolts. All right, next step is to install our cam chain tensioner. There's 3 different kinds. Could be mechanical, hydraulic, or an aftermarket automatic tensioner like ours. So to get ours in, what we need to do is insert this piece, tighten it down. We've already installed our new crush washer on there. Now you do want this snug, you don't want to over tighten it though. We are just going into aluminum. Now with ours, we're going to apply some assembly lube to this and install the plunger. And next we'll install the auto chain tensioner with the gasket. And for now, I'm leaving the plunger out just to get these bolts in position. Now to actually get this in place, what we're going to have to do is get the plunger to come back in. So taking a small flat blade screwdriver, I'll turn it clockwise. That'll allow that plunger to come in. We'll get these bolt threads started. Now no matter what you do, you don't want to tighten these bolts down until that plunger's all the way in and this housing seats fully against the other housing that you bolted to your cylinder. If you do this, if you tighten these down without it looking like this, what's going to happen is it's going to put a lot of pressure on that cam chain and it could possibly damage it. So make sure you have this adjuster turned all the way clockwise while you tighten these down. Torque on these, you're going to be 7 foot-pounds, and then same thing on this back bolt. All right, now those bolts are torqued. I can, again, make sure this is all the way clockwise, remove it. It's going to snap out and put tension on that cam chain. Now we can install the bolt on the back. Now, depending what style you have, you could either have an O-ring here or a crush washer. So make sure that's in place and tighten the bolt down. Now for the other two styles of tensioner, if you have a hydraulic tensioner, that bolt is just going to stick out maybe to about right there. So you've got about 1/8 of an inch, and you're going to torque that one to 29 foot-pounds. If you have the mechanical style, you're going to have two bolts that mount it up. Those bolts you'll torque to 7 foot-pounds, and then the back bolt with the spring, you're going to torque that one to 15 foot-pounds. Once you have your tensioner on, you want to rotate your engine over a couple of revolutions, make sure nothing hangs up, and then verify that your timing is still spot on. The next step is to install the valve cover gasket. Now, this gasket does not come in the gasket kit, so if you need it, you can get it under the OEM diagram. And I'm putting a little high temp silicone in these corners, just on these half moons, to help it seal better. And the reason that I mentioned this gasket doesn't come in the kit is because if it looks questionable in any way, you definitely want to get it replaced. Next, we'll install the valve cover. Once you have the bolts tightened down, we'll install the oil filler cap. After that, we can install and tighten our new spark plugs. Next, I'm going to take my new gasket and apply it to this cooling elbow. We'll tighten these 3 bolts down to 7 foot-pounds. Now, all of these little bolts on these little brackets we're going to be putting on, they're going to be 7 foot-pounds. After that, we can install our dipstick. Then we'll install our oil filter. Now with the oil filter, as soon as that gasket lightly touches the surface, we're going to go another 3/4 to 1 turn. And you want to make sure you have some oil on this gasket when it goes on. Next, we'll install a new O-ring on this thermostat housing. Next, we'll install the thermostat and the cover. After that, we'll install our intake manifolds. All right, next we're going to install our torque limiting gear. We applied some assembly lube to this shaft. We'll slide this into place. And it's a good idea, make sure this one-way clutch is actually working. So if you're looking at it this way, it's going to rotate freely counterclockwise and lock up going clockwise. Now before we install the gasket, I'm just going to put some sealant on both case half cracks where it splits, just to be on the safe side. And I'm just putting just a teeny bit. We'll go ahead and set that gasket in place. And you want to make sure both dowel pins are in the correct locations. Now with the cover, where this rubber piece goes onto the metal, I'm just going to put a little bit of sealant on both sides of that. And then I'm also going to apply some assembly lube to this bearing. Now when you're installing this cover, be really careful with it. It's magnetized, it's going to pull on really hard, so make sure your fingers aren't in any pinch points. Next, we'll install the stator cover bolts, and we're going to torque them down in the following sequence to 9 foot-pounds. Now you're probably going to want to follow along with us with this sequence in your service manual. So this is going to be number 1, this is number 2, number 3, number 4, number 5, 6, 7, number 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, and 13. Next up, backside of the water pump, we're going to replace these O-rings. And just be really careful anytime you're using a pick. You don't want to poke yourself. Next, we'll apply some grease to our new O-rings, put them back into place. Now we can flip the water pump over. So we'll go ahead and remove these bolts the rest of the way. And we're going to install our new O-ring. So we'll pick this one out, and then I'm actually going to use a little bit of rubber sealant to hold the new one into place. You also want to clean the sealing surface on this impeller housing. Now I'm just taking some rubber adhesive. This stuff is from Honda, but it's still going to work. Now this stuff dries pretty quick, so you want to get that gasket or O-ring in place and wipe off any excess. That way you're not left with a mess. All right, now to get the water pump in place, we have a shaft coming off our oil pump that's going to engage the shaft coming from the water pump. To get these lined up, I'm actually going to have this offset to start with so I can feel it hit that shaft, turn it, and then it's going to drop into place. And you want to make sure these O-rings are greased up really well. I'm also greasing up this bore right here so it slides into place. All right, now to get the pump cover on, what we're going to do, we have the 3 bolts that hold this together here, here, and here. So we'll go ahead and put those on, but I do want to point out it's going to be a lot easier if you slide this upper hose into place first. So we'll go ahead and do that. And then just make sure your gasket or O-ring hasn't moved, which ours is fine, it's glued into place. And these bolts, these are going to be the silver ones. They're all the same length. Then we'll go ahead, these 2 longer bolts that are this brass color, we'll go there, and then the shorter one, it's going to go in that bottom left-hand corner. And I know you guys are tired of hearing this, but 7 foot-pounds. All right, now for the oil cooler hoses, we'll slide them into place and install the clamps. Now we'll connect our cooling hose on this side and install that clamp as well. And that is it for the assembly of our RZR motor. If you need any of the parts or tools that we used today, be sure to check them out and pick them up on our website. We offer free shipping on orders over $75. Now the next thing for us, we're going to get this mounted up to our engine hoist, and that way we can be prepped for the next thing we need to do, which is install this back into the RZR. So make sure you follow us over to the next video in our engine rebuilding series. We'll show you how to do that, and if you haven't already, subscribe to our YouTube channel for more helpful content. Thanks for watching.